I'd like to thank all of you for coming out today on Father's Day and Juneteenth. I started collecting Civil War images and relics while in elementary school at the beginning of the Civil War centennial. Then after graduation from college is when I started my teaching career and focused on collecting 19th and early 20th century photography. I realized that this was a field where there was great opportunity still existed to build an important collection, since early photography was largely ignored by cultural institutions and most collectors. So I begin our adventure and share with you all today what I have found along the way. While on this journey, I came across African American images. I knew that these were important, but few seemed to care about them. And they were important springboard to learning to share with my students. So I built a carefully curated teaching collection to promote visual and cultural understanding through 800 photographs, documents, prints, books, and three-dimensional objects. My collection spans from 1750 print of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, the earliest identified portrait of an enslaved person in colonial America, and who also had a Maryland connection since he lived in the colony for 2 years, to the iconic Barack Obama portrait that actually launched a series of lawsuits over copyright violations by the artist. Living in Maryland, the history of photography of my state soon became a major focus of my collecting. My state was also a rich resource for African American images and other historically related material. In the 1860 census, there were over 87,000 enslaved people in Maryland, but there were almost 84,000 who were designated as free colored. Maryland had the largest population of free African Americans in the United States. One of my collecting goals has been to gather the portraits and the stories of these people, some of whom are in this exhibit today. And I will also include some in my talk that did not fit into the space we had here for the exhibit. Here's the original quarter plate daguerreotype that you see at the beginning of the exhibit and serves as an arc for the presentation, since this story goes from antebellum era to Reconstruction. It is a powerful image of a nurse with her charge looking like the lioness ready to protect her cub from the stranger in the strange room aiming what looks like a small cannon at them. Now this is a 6-plate daguerreotype, but I don't own of the same woman. She's identified as Martha Ann or Patty Atavis. It was part of a grouping purchased by the Maryland Historical Society in 2011, which is now known as the Maryland Center for History and Culture after a recent name change. The daguerreotype was part of an auction lot that came up locally. It included a quarter plate tintype of Patty with a child identified as Alice, along with assorted documents. These documents included the 1839 bill of sale of 23-year-old Patty to Baltimore physician Dr. John Whitridge for $200, which was about $4,400 today, to be, quote, to be a slave for life. The lot sold for $32,000. In a separate lot were the images of the Whitridge family. I was able to acquire that lot, which included this 6-plate daguerreotype of Patty's owner, Dr. John Whitridge. It was taken by Baltimore daguerrean Joseph Marsters. The Maryland Historical Society published the tintype on the cover of their magazine. I thought I'd seen the image before, possibly in a publication by some collecting groups, but I couldn't find it. Then about a year and a half later, there appeared in a Virginia auction this. As I suspected, the tintype was a laterally reversed copy of a daguerreotype. In the case behind the image was this inscription. It was Anna Whitridge, not Alice, being held by Patty, and the daguerreotype was also taken by Joseph Marsters. Patty Atavis and the Whitridge family maintained a very special relationship. Dr. Whitridge wrote in his will that if he died before Patty, she was to receive an annual stipend of $100, and she could live with any of his children of her choosing. Unfortunately for Patty, she died in 1874 before the doctor. Dr. Whitridge had her buried in his family plot in Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore. Here is her tombstone today. The inscription reads, Patty Ann Atavis, a faithful and devoted nurse in the family of Dr. John Whitridge for over 36 years. Died October 26, 1874. The story of an enslaved Marylander is added to our national memory. In light of African American historian Dr. Robert Woodson Sr.'s article, Heroes Arose from the Brutality of Slavery, was in yesterday's Wall Street Journal. I added this image in my collection. It was not in the exhibit. Woodson wrote that, quote, "We need to remember the brutality, but we should also remember the resistance to slavery, which was ultimately successful. That these heroic black figures from the past teach us that we all have the capacity to succeed against extraordinary odds." The 6-plate daguerreotype that turned up on eBay a number of years ago is one of those stories. The cover glass was corroded and the image on the silver plate was poorly photographed. But the sellers were in Baltimore, so I contacted them to go see it. When I finally got to handle it, I saw the potential hidden below the cover glass, and I was successful in its purchase. Once I removed the glass, I was stunned. She reminded me of the portrait of Pinky by English portrait painter Thomas Lawrence that now hangs in the Huntington Library in California. And she became my American Pinky. But who was she? The antique dealers who sold it told me that it had been found in a trash pile, left abandoned in a Baltimore row house. Along with the group was a cane presented by Frederick Douglass to somebody with the surname of Bishop that they had already sold. Bingo! The Bishops were a prominent free African American family in Maryland and New York. Charity folks had been manumitted in the early 1800s and began acquiring real estate in Baltimore and Annapolis, Maryland's capital city. She earned enough money to purchase the freedom of her husband and family. Her daughter, also named Charity, became known as Little Charity, and this daughter married William Bishop. William, an African American, was one of the 12 wealthiest men of all races in Annapolis. And Little Charity followed her mother's footsteps into successfully real estate investing. Living with Little Charity Bishop in 1850 was Josephine Folks, age 7. Josephine was the granddaughter of Charity Folks and the girl in the daguerreotype. The image was taken in Boston by Tyler and Company and made possible through the Bishop family's New York connection. Along with the daguerreotype, the antique dealers found the striking 6-plate ambrotype portrait of Josephine, taken some 10 years later during the Civil War. Josephine Folks now takes her place in the American memory. Here are a few images from my collection of antebellum Maryland, also not in the exhibit. This is the home of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Maryland's signer of the Declaration of Independence, that is from a series of photographs taken by Henry Pollock, the most enduring of Baltimore's pioneer photographers. Charles Carroll is also the richest man in Maryland. The estate is named Reagan Manor and remains in the hands of the Carroll family today as a private residence. And the photograph gives us a glimpse into the life of some during the antebellum period. Charles Carroll V, the signer's grandson, inherited the estate. In 1860 slave census records that he owned 77 enslaved persons at the time. This is a view of the back of the house with his yet-to-be-identified enslaved gardener. And here some of the Carroll family and friends were preparing for an afternoon ride. Note the little boy standing next to the steps to help the ladies mount their horses' side saddle. Carroll's slave census recorded 2 boys, aged 8 and 9. We may never know his name, but he was photographed at least once, documenting his personhood. Though anonymous, he takes his place in the American memory. On April 12, 1861, the Confederacy attacks Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, as the Civil War begins. Abraham Lincoln calls for 60,000 troops to come to Washington, D.C. to protect the capital, caught in the middle between Virginia, that had seceded, and Maryland, that was teetering on the brink of secession. Among the first defenders to respond were the Washington artillery from Pennsylvania. To get to the capital, troops traveled by rail from the north had to pass through Baltimore. Upon arrival, they had to change railroad lines by marching through the city to connect to the B&O Railroad to get to the capital. As the troops marched down the street, a crowd of protesters gathered and followed them. Soon stones were being thrown at the northern invaders, and Nick Biddle, a black servant to the company's commander, was struck in the head, causing a wound that bled profusely. The troops eventually made it to the B&O station in the nation's capital, where Biddle's wounds were tended to. When he returned home, he sat for a series of photographs that recorded his new status as one of the first to be wounded in the war. These are some of the carte de visites published to promote Nick Biddle's Red Badge of Courage. The one on the right is particularly rare, since it was made up to be distributed by the unit's commander, James Wren, who had autographed it. Fortunately, they had not arrived a day later, when troops from Massachusetts were attacked and gunfire broke out, killing and wounded soldiers and civilians in what became known as the Pratt Street Riot. This 6-plate ambrotype was found in a Pennsylvania auction. The slip of paper seen here was in the case behind the image and is inscribed a peculiar institution. The term peculiar institution was a Southern euphemism for slavery. Who was the audience for this intimate viewing? Was it passed around at a gathering of abolitionists? Certainly the intent was the condemnation of an institution that held children, such as innocent girls, as chattel. And maybe there's a more subtle message if these are two sisters holding hands and wearing matching dresses. Perhaps the lighter complexion of the girl on the right tells that she is the daughter of her master. Many unanswered questions remain, but it is a powerful and intriguing portrait. This is an unidentified 9th-plate ambrotype found at a local flea market. The original is only about 2 inches by 2 inches in size. His apron signals to viewers that he was celebrating his entrance into a world of work instead of school. The key to interpreting his work is held in the boy's hand. When collecting photographs, it is useful to have knowledge of the material culture of the era to help interpret images. In his hand, he holds a ceramic tobacco pipe bowl that had a reed stem stuck into the bowl to make it a stronger alternative to the traditional and more fragile clay pipe. There were 5 potteries in Baltimore in 1860 in which he could have worked. But was he enslaved or free? We will probably never know. Frederick Douglass's master hired him out as a ship's caulker in Baltimore. I believe this is the earliest image of an African American child engaged in industrial labor. 19th century studio portraits depicting occupations of children were taken as a celebration of their work. It would make an interesting exhibit to contrast these with the photographs of Lewis Hines taken in the early 1900s to condemn child labor. This is another unidentified 6-plate ambrotype that I recently obtained. The subjects were unknown, but their expression of affection for each other was obvious. Are they a master with his enslaved servant? Father and son? Unfortunately, their identities and the basis of the relationship have been lost in time. It reminds me of the abolitionist logo, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Whoever the audience was for this image, it was a powerful statement in its day, and its message continues to resonate in our times as it takes its place as an iconic image in the American memory. This young man was photographed in Frederick, Maryland for his carte de visite. In his case, information on the back provided his name and legal status. Jack Bruner, a slave boy, was owned by Valentine Byerly, a successful businessman in Frederick. His owners became very wealthy and established the Valentine Byerly Scholarship at the University of Virginia, which still exists today. No census records for Jack were found after the war, and he probably was never able to take advantage of the Byerly Scholarship. Civilian life on the home front went on as the war raged. This is an intriguing carte de visite of an unidentified black woman who was taken by Jacob Byerly in Frederick. The laundress is posed with her new wash tub and attached washing machine. No patent for this device has yet been located, and the subject, as well as her legal standing, remains unknown. It was just recently licensed, this image, for use with PBS program by Dr. Henry Louis Gates, so you'll likely see this on TV. There are several carte de visites I consider classics that had to be part of my collection of African American photographs. Frederick Douglass was a native son of Maryland and the most photographed person of the 19th century. Interestingly enough, despite his numerous visits to Maryland, he never sat for a Maryland photographer. This portrait was taken in Hillsdale, Michigan, where he stopped to speak at the college there on his way to Chicago after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. It was the first college in the U.S. Whose charter banned discrimination based on race, sex, or religion. And though I have tried, I have yet to add a photograph of Harriet Tubman, another Marylander, to my collection. However, this print is important since it was published in her biography, written by Sarah Bradford and published in 1869. Presented holding a rifle with a haversack slung around her shoulder, an expression of fierce determination, it was the first image of Harriet to be widely circulated. The previous unknown carte de visite of Harriet Tubman was part of a group purchased by the Library of Congress and the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2017 for $161,000. I was one of the many underbidders. Harriet's photographic portraits are rare since her images were never widely reproduced and marketed like her other contemporaries. Reverend Josiah Henson was an escaped enslaved person from Maryland. He met with Harriet Beecher Stowe and shared with her the experiences of his life in bondage. In her book, Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, published after her landmark novel, Stowe identified Henson as one of the sources for the Uncle Tom character in her book. For the remainder of his life, Josiah Henson promoted the connection to Uncle Tom. He was even granted an audience with Queen Victoria during a visit to England. His home today in Maryland commemorates his life. To take advantage of the popularity of Uncle Tom's Cabin, potteries in England produced a variety of figurines featuring characters Little Eva and Uncle Tom. This also included a set of dessert dishes featuring scenes from the novel, including this one of Uncle Tom being whipped to death. Can you imagine enjoying some cake at a tea party with this staring back at you? This is a rare photograph of Lewis Carleton, a former enslaved Marylander, whose cart noted his suffering, quote, the worst effects of slavery. After he obtained his freedom, he tried to open a church for African Americans and a school for black children in Maryland. His efforts did not get local support, so he left for England. While there, he was on the lecture circuit advocating abolition, women's rights, and temperance, where this portrait was taken. After his death, he was buried there in England. This is a portrait of emancipated slaves from Louisiana that were brought north to raise money for the establishment of schools there. Their photographs were sold throughout the North as a testament to the horrors of slavery. Under Louisiana laws, the 4 children who appeared Caucasian had been enslaved. While on tour, they were denied entrance to stay in a hotel in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, due to their race. These are one of more than 20 studio photographs that were made of the group to be sold by the abolitionists. In this view, the 3 Caucasian children posed with branded slave Wilson Chin, with the timeless message that learning is wealth. My collection includes a classic portrait of Wilson Chin, displaying all the devices used to punish enslaved persons. Note Wilson Chin's forehead branded with the initials VBM for Volsey B. McMillian, who had been his slave owner. And I also included in the exhibit a guide to the instruments of torture that were included as props in the photograph. In the classic and iconic portrait of the scourged back of Gordon, an escaped slave, in the page from Harper's Weekly that claimed to tell a story. Recent scholarship has placed into question the connection of the 2 accompanying portraits of Gordon. The image made the cover of the New Yorker magazine 2 years ago, and we can only wonder what Gordon would have thought. And by the way, supposedly in the fall, there will be a movie out called Emancipation, involved with Will Smith, about the adventure of life of Gordon. A less common card is the portrait of Abraham, a slave blown to freedom. During the siege of Vicksburg, the Union Army was building a tunnel under the rebel fortifications to blow a hole in the wall. A group of enslaved men were tasked by the rebels with digging down a shaft to find the tunnel when the mine was exploded, throwing Abraham up into the air where he landed behind the Union lines. Stunned, but otherwise unhurt, he became an immediate celebrity amongst the troops and was photographed to sell his shadows as souvenirs, and his story was carried in Harper's Weekly. This is a carte de visite I was able to recently identify but I was unable to fit into the exhibit. The lady with her servant is Elizabeth Diety Ridgely. Diety was the daughter of John Carnan Ridgely, the third master of Hampton Mansion in Towson, Maryland, that is now a National Park historical site. Diety's mother, also named Elizabeth, was the subject of this Thomas Sully painting, now in the National Gallery of Art. Diety Ridgely married Dr. Thomas Buckler, seen on the left, a prominent physician in Baltimore who owned a 36-year-old black female in the 1850 slave census. Perhaps this was the servant posed with Diety. The carte de visite was taken in the Boston Gallery, J.W. Black, with the date of December 6, 1864 on the tax stamp. This makes an interesting point about the relationship between the two women. Though slavery had yet to be abolished in the United States, it had been outlawed under Maryland's new state constitution, just adopted in November of 1864. The woman holding Diety's cloak posed as if the two were taking a stroll along some fashionable promenade, was actually free. Numerous copies of this carte de visite exist with various descriptions about where it was taken. Though unsigned by the photographers, it was evidently the work of William McPherson and his partner Oliver while they operated in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The image displays a remarkable array of clothing worn by the contraband subjects. Noticeable is the lack of many black men in the scene. This could be the result of the heavy recruiting efforts conducted in the area to fill the ranks of the new U.S. colored troop regiments. The back of my car is inscribed with the location Bullard Plantation, 1864. The only Bullard listed as a slaveholder in Louisiana in the 1860 slave census was Charles Adam Bullard. His property north of Baton Rouge had been converted to a contraband camp. The mansion house is seen on the left. Today, the columns for the house are displayed on the campus of Northwestern State University. Though the identities of these people currently remain unknown, their inclusion in the group portrait remains evidence of their personhood, a fate denied millions of others who were enslaved. A copy of this portrait is in the Library of Congress collection, but the story behind it was unknown until the card recently appeared on eBay. Carefully inscribed on the back was the story of William Headley that I quote. William Headley, a contraband from the plantation near Raleigh, North Carolina, arrived at New Bern, North Carolina on the 20th May, 1864, having been 6 weeks on the road, neither sleeping or eating in a house during that time. 2 others left with him, but were caught by the slaveholders' bloodhounds and either killed or taken back. He was weak and nearly famished when he arrived. His clothes were of many colors and qualities. His cloak consisted of an old cotton grain bag, slit open on one side, and was raveled, which gave the appearance of rich fringe. He appeared perfectly happy and satisfied upon reaching the Union lines, and he is now one of the best hands working on Fort Chase, North Carolina, June 14, 1864. And we can thank Captain Horace James for thinking enough of William to preserve his story on the back of this card. James was appointed the superintendent for all blacks in North Carolina in April 1863 until the end of the war. Thanks to Captain James Headley, now takes his rightful place in the American memory. Now, I found this rare carte de visite of Aunt Mary for sale recently on the internet. Aunt Mary Dines was an enslaved person from Maryland who found refuge in Washington, D.C. after traveling on the Underground Railroad. As the war raged and contraband flooded the capital, camps were established to provide housing for them around the city. Aunt Mary took up residence in Camp Barker, which happened to be near the soldiers' home, where Abraham Lincoln would travel to seek solace from the stresses of the war. While there, Aunt Mary, known for her soprano voice, organize a chorus to entertain the president during his first visit, and she became his contact for organizing performances as his visits became more frequent. The caption on the card is based on the spiritual Palms of Victory. Aunt Mary was noted for her knowledge of spirituals and hymns. And this is the memorial entrance today to what had been Camp Barker. An elementary school is now located on the site. More than 18,000 African American men served in the U.S. Navy during the Civil War. Among them was William H. Tucker, born free in Baltimore, who is shown here probably with his father, after he enlisted in February 1864 and received their rank of landsman, the lowest rating in the Navy. By April, Tucker was assigned to the USS Wyalusing and was aboard when his ship, along with 3 others, got into a battle with the rebel ironclad Albemarle. Tucker's ship closed in on the ram with guns blazing, but failed to damage the rebel vessel when the shells bounced off its iron plates. In turn, Tucker's ship received 6 hits from the Albemarle's guns, killing 1 sailor. Tucker survived his action, completed his service, and was discharged in March 1865. Through his carte de visite, his contribution to the fight for freedom lives on. Now, this is a quarter-plate ambrotype now in the Library of Congress that I used to own. It has become an iconic image for the black experience in the Civil War. A supposed researcher claimed in a Kentucky Magazine article from November 2012 to have identified the soldier and his family members. This is absolutely false. I obtained this from a longtime friend who acquired the image for $10 in 1967 from a friend and dealer in Cecil County, Maryland, who found it somewhere, probably on the eastern shore of Maryland. Maryland contributed 6 colored regiments to the Union Army, and this was undoubtedly one of those recruited. I included it in the exhibit I guest curated at the Maryland Historical Society in 2006. Interestingly enough, it was the one image from the exhibit that the Washington Post wanted to include with their review of my exhibit. I also featured it in my book, Maryland Civil War Photographs. In a weak moment, I sold it to Tom Liljenquist, which is why it resides in the Library of Congress now and belongs to everybody. This 9th plate ambrotype of this anonymous black soldier that is the logo for the exhibit surfaced several years ago in a Massachusetts auction. The image is laterally reversed, and the photographer carefully highlighted U.S. in gold over the reverse lettering on the soldier's brass belt plate. Stuffed in his belt, the soldier added a Sheffield dagger and a Colt Root revolver to project his sense of purpose. This may have actually been a photographer's props, since his rifle and required equipment would already be a weighty challenge for a foot soldier. The power of this portrait of this young man ready to do battle also elevates it to iconic status. Ron Connington, who was actually in our audience, agreed with me when he placed it on the cover of Military Images magazine, summer 2018 issue. I was pleased to have the opportunity to be able to acquire it. I was looking for an arm image of an identified black soldier and was able to recently acquire this carte de visite. This is Private Turner Nelson, who initially served in the 67th Regiment U.S. Colored Troops. Turner was born enslaved in Virginia. His master's son, Ira Nelson, inherited him and took him along when the new master moved to Missouri. In 1863, slaves in several border states were allowed to enlist into the Union Army with their master's permission and could henceforth be free. Turner soon enlisted and served until January 1867. Though he didn't see combat, he provided support service to the Union Army while his regiment was devastated by disease. We can thank Reverend D.W. Goodrich, who was a missionary to the black troops at Benton Barracks in Missouri, for preserving Turner's photograph. The military-themed backdrop was extensively used for portraits taken at Benton Barracks. In 1866, Ira Nelson, Turner's former owner, applied for compensation for allowing his enslaved property to enlist. After certifying his loyalty to the Union, the former slaveholder was paid $300 for the loss of his property. And as part of his enduring legacy, Nelson's name is recorded on the walls of the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. This is a panoramic view identified as the camp of General William Birney's troops that is not in the exhibit. At the time, Birney was commander of the 3rd Division, 10th Corps of the Union Army, composed of African American soldiers. Taken in 4 exposures, the prints of the segments were spliced together to make the panorama. Featured are at least several regiments in line of battle, 2 ranks deep, that stretches off into the distance on the right. This unique image graphically captures the power that African American troops contributed to the outcome of the Civil War. Probably among those in the previous panorama is William Denby, member of the 4th U.S. Colored Troops organized in Baltimore in the summer of 1863. William was born on Maryland's eastern shore to a free mother and enslaved father. After his father died prematurely, William went to work on local farms to support his mother. He enlisted in the 4th U.S. Colored Troops in August 1863 and was later promoted to corporal. The 4th saw combat throughout the remainder of the war. During the Battle of Sugarloaf Hill in January 1865 in North Carolina, William was wounded in the leg, which led to its amputation. While traveling on a hospital ship back to Baltimore, he died from his wounds. All Union soldiers that served during the Civil War qualified for a pension. Parents of soldiers who died could receive it if their son was their sole means of support. William's mother applied for his pension in 1867. For some reason, her claim was dropped until a new lawyer took up her case in 1885. This time, she was granted his pension retroactive to the date of her son's death. I'd always been wondering where William was buried. During the pandemic lockdown, I found online this document that I'd never seen before. It documented his internment in grave 180, Loudon Park National Cemetery, which was only about 20 minutes from my house. So on a warm June day, my wife Nancy and I set out on an adventure to see if we could locate his grave. We didn't worry about social distancing since no other visitors were there, and besides, everybody else was already dead. We searched for hours to no avail and finally gave up as the afternoon got hotter. And while heading up the road, we unexpectedly found the headquarters of the cemetery, and a kind gentleman there volunteered to help us. After some time, he came out and showed us what he found. So we immediately returned to that part of the cemetery we had just been searching. To our amazement, William Denby was buried under the wrong name. What had been Demby, D-E-M-B-Y, clearly on the cemetery record, became Demley, D-E-M-L-Y, on his tombstone. And his name is not on the African American Civil War Memorial. So this has been a sad ending for a soldier who gave his last full measure for the Union. Now this is a portrait of another member of the 4th USCT. The soldier wearing the medals is Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood. Fleetwood was born free in Maryland. The family of the sugar importing and processing business that his father worked for took an interest in Christian's future. They saw to it that he was educated, and Christian graduated from college. He was even sent as a business representative to Liberia and Sierra Leone in Africa. Upon his return, he also helped start a newspaper in Baltimore before enlisting in the 4th USCT in July of 1864. Due to his education and experience, he was immediately promoted to Sergeant Major of the regiment. During the Battle of New Market Heights in September 1864 in Virginia, his regiment was ordered to be part of a major assault against the rebel trenches. During the charge, his regiment was subject to devastating fire from the rebels, and several soldiers from the Union who attempted to carry the regiment's flags forward were shot down. Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood picked up the national colors, and another soldier grabbed the regimental flag, and they advanced to the top of the enemy's defenses. Though the troops failed to capture the position, Christian Fleetwood retreated with the flag, miraculously unscathed, to rally his troops. This is the flag Christian Fleetwood saved that day that is now in the Maryland Center for History and Culture collection and had been presented to the regiment by the Colored Ladies of Baltimore. Fleetwood's diaries are in the Library of Congress. For his action on that September day, Christian Fleetwood was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. It is now in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution. He is wearing the medal on the left in his photograph. The medal on the right is known as the Army of the James or Butler Medal. This was a special medal that General Benjamin Butler had struck to present to the colored troops in his command for their service as part of the Army of the James in 1864. At the end of the war, the white officers of the 4th USCT petitioned the War Department to promote Christian Fleetwood to the rank of a commissioned officer. The request was denied, undoubtedly due to his race. Now, why did I take all this time talking about my collection to focus on Fleetwood's story? After many years of searching, this is a carte de visite of Christian Fleetwood that I recently obtained in an auction. It is the only studio photograph of Fleetwood taken right at the end of the war with his medals. And this is the only known copy to surface. Taken in the Baltimore photography studio of Richard Walsall, Fleetwood signed the back of his portrait. It is important to note how he presented himself. He does not have the chevrons of a sergeant major on his sleeves, and he poses gripping a Model 1850 regulation field officer's sword, giving very much the impression of being a commissioned officer. A rank, despite his bravery, he was denied. Eventually, he did become an officer after the war in the D.C. National Guard, whose uniform he wears with his medals in this cabinet card on the left that is in the exhibit. And here's his grave marker with my photographs taken during another pandemic outing. Christian Fleetwood is buried in a black cemetery near the stadium in Maryland for the football team previously known as the Redskins. Now, this is a recent addition to my collection, and one of my favorites. To me, our anonymous subject's expression is one of defiant joy, as she has deliberately held a book in her hand. Books as props in early photographic portraits were common to reflect the literacy of the subject. But here it takes on an even more important symbolism, as she appears to say to us, I'm going to read this book and no one can stop me now. Now, with the end of the war and abolition of slavery, the nation could now address the issue of literacy of all Americans. And one more war-related story. This is a cabinet card of a woman that appeared in an auction years ago, wearing a ribbon for the Grand Army of the Republic, a fraternal organization for men who served in the Union Army. I had never seen anything like this before, so I was successful in my bidding. The back of the card included some of the information about her story. This was Elizabeth Fairfax, who had been a runaway slave in Mississippi when she hooked up with the 29th Iowa Regiment during the siege of Vicksburg. She worked for them as a nurse and scout. At the end of the war, she followed them back to their hometown in Clinton, Iowa, where she was quickly embraced by the community. She was allowed to attend reunions of the veterans and marched with them in their Memorial Day parades. She purchased a modest house, worked for a local grocer, and, quote, sold her shadows to support herself. In addition to taking work as a laundress, Aunt Lizzie sold chewing gum and the sundries along the town's main street. To her customers, she was always remarked, God bless you, honey. On April 22nd, 1908, she passed away quietly in her home. For her funeral, all the GAR post-veterans were requested to attend her funeral, and they turned out to honor her. She had a favorite Methodist hymn, and the author even attended her funeral service to perform it in her memory. Her pallbearers included 3 of the veterans. Elizabeth Fairfax was buried in the town cemetery in the section reserved for the veterans. Aunt Lizzie was buried with her boys. Her grave today still has the iron marker used for members of the Grand Army of the Republic, though she was never able to join officially. Photography has ensured this humble African-American lady's story will endure. And it is another story that should be more widely told. Now in this program I've been showing you examples of daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, carte de visites, and cabinet cards from my collection. This is a new edition just published with Pinky on the cover of my classic first book, Introduction to African American Photographs, 1840 to 1950, that discusses these and other photographic formats that have recorded the African American experience. This is the first book to ever discuss the identification, research, care, and collecting of African American photographs that is based on my more than 50 years of experience of working with these images and is now available on Amazon. In this exhibit and today's presentation are just a few of more than 100 stories, along with original photographs, prints, and historic objects from my collection of over 800 items that are featured in the 3 parts of my Black Lives in Focus series that have recently been published as Kindle books and in print as softcover books on Amazon. And the Black Lives in Focus series is now available with even more stories and illustrations from my collection as a 300-page indexed hardcover book also on Amazon. So I encourage you now to go back and view the portraits in this exhibit with my free brochure available at the help desk as you guide and experience their humanity and their stories as they speak to us through these windows of time about those years so long ago in this important chapter of our history that continues to resonate with us today.